The other day at the gym, I listened to a podcast on our need for belonging to a group. Of course, evolution suggests that. I mean, hunters and gatherers, it's kind of being a little important to be part of the group, just for survival. But also, anecdotally, I think most of us could look back maybe to middle school and high school and recall how important it was to fit in, to be part of a group, and really how important it was to be part of a good group. Without this, without that belonging, we seem to become susceptible to what we'd call nowadays being radicalized. Pledging allegiance to ISIS, for example, or just more easily taken advantage of by online influencers. Kind of think of what we've called our wall of witnesses in a similar manner. I mean, there have been a few people who've had reservations about that, and that's fine. The overwhelming majority have wanted that. And we've even had a number, people who originally put, "I want to remain anonymous," after they saw what we were doing, come back and say, actually we'd be okay with our name being on that. Obviously, not because they wanted name recognition, they wanted to stay anonymous, but they wanted to be part of the group, belonging to something larger, doing something that, is simply not possible as an individual or even a little family. The person being interviewed in this podcast is the president of a philanthropic organization. He said that the sense of belonging and identity, kind of identifying yourself with the group, is needed in order to give. Which group matters a lot? Get this, he said that 70% of voluntary giving, charitable giving in the U.S., flows through faith-based organizations. That's a huge percentage. 70% of charitable giving in the U.S. flows through faith-based organizations. That also creates a little bit of a concern, doesn't it, with the decrease in religious involvement? As communion with God decreases, so communion and concern for other human beings does too. The account from John 6 that we've been reading from for the past few weeks is set against the backdrop of the Passover and the Exodus. That's what Jesus was referring to when he said, "And like your ancestors who ate and still died. During the journey through the desert, they were hungry, God provided them manna, they ate it, and they still died." The Passover and Exodus was the constitutive event for the Israelites. It's what formed them into a people, into a nation, from a disparate group of tribes and families. Now, this historical fact passed into the rules for the way in which Passover was to be celebrated, connecting it with family, household, and membership in the people of Israel. And the rules made a special provision for pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem for Passover to join together for the feast. Now, Jesus followed this prescription when he celebrated it with his apostles. Do you remember when someone approached him and said, "Hey, your mother and your brothers," which means cousins, right? "Your mother and your brothers are looking for you." Do you remember that? And what did he say? "Well, who are my mother and my brothers?" And he pointed to those around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brother. For whoever does the will of God is my mother and brother and sister." Membership, family, belonging was radically expanded and focused around him, so that those who followed him were keeping the will of God and became this universal family. It became open to all, but it involved a rather rigorous entry into Jesus' family, which comes out in some of the writings of the earliest Christians on the Eucharist. Summarizing this, Pope Benedict, whose research I've been following, said that this isn't about being inclusive or exclusive, but it has to do with the fact that the church profoundly becomes one thing, one body with the Lord, so that she can forcefully bring his life and light into the world. It has to do with being an effective witness. If you don't believe this and you're known, then it compromises the integrity of the witness. Do you see it? That's why if we're not in full communion, well, then we don't receive communion, right? If Protestants come here, we'd say, okay, you're welcome to come for a blessing. If we go somewhere else to a Protestant church, we'd say, okay, well, we don't receive communion there because we're unfortunately not in full communion. But even for Catholics, well, if we're not in communion, we've skipped Mass all the way down to, well, I didn't fast before I came, or I'm chewing gum, well, then we say, okay, well, I'm not in communion. It has to do with being an effective, honest witness. Now, what's fascinating is that after the Last Supper, where Jesus said, do this in memory of me, Jesus' disciples didn't gather together to celebrate at supper time, as was the case with Passover, but on Sunday morning, which presupposes the death of Jesus and the encounter with him raised from the dead. This is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for his resurrection, that faithful Jews almost immediately left off the practice of Passover and celebrating the Sabbath to gather on the day Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to his disciples. Here's the constitutive element of the renewed people of God. Here's what forms them, us, into a people, and gives them and us their identity and mission. Do this in memory of me. Be transformed by this. Live like this. This isn't the repetition of the Passover meal Christ's disciples are saying to us, but an encounter with the risen Lord. It wasn't and it isn't first a meal, but an encounter, a sacrament, communion. It's not unlike what happens when we come across a memento of a loved one, a piece of clothing, for example, which smells like them, and through that, there's a real encounter that happens. All the more so with the one whom death could not contain, and who said, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Which must be possible if Jesus' words are to make any sense at all, right? Why would he say being nourished by an encounter with him under the form of bread and wine brings true life if it wasn't possible or it wasn't real? And so here we are with the background of Passover and the Exodus as a metaphor for the journey through life, which at times feels like a journey through the desert with temptations, struggles, needs, disappointments. Now we know something of what that feels like here at JP2 as we've wondered about in the first years of our existence. Like the Israelites, there have been great faith and courage, and like them, maybe a little doubting and grumbling from time to time. Who's to say? From the beginning, there have been some hesitant to give out of a concern that nothing will end up being built. Others wonder what happens if we don't raise enough funds. Is it time to have that discussion, do you think? Both are totally understandable. But it strikes me that God's the one who called us out from a former way of life. This is his initiative, not ours. He sees the whole picture. We don't. For me, it seems that it's not for us to put limits on how God would provide for us, but to pursue every path he opens up for us. Here's something of what I mean. Our last campaign update was in July. At that time, we had been campaigning, crusading, for 12 weeks. And we had raised $6.2 million. Our campaign company was stunned, thrilled by the amount that we raised there. In the last 9 weeks, how much do you think we've raised? What have your mind and heart been suggesting to you as we've journeyed along? Where have the doubts been? Where's the maybe apathy been? What do you believe that God can do? In the first 12 weeks, we raised $6.2 million. In the last 9 weeks, God has blessed us with $5.1 million. That brings our total to $11.3 million, which is 76% of our $15 million goal. Yeah, now at 4 p.m. they spontaneously clapped, yes. 7:30 did with their faces. It was too early to get the arms moving. Remember, our total project costs are estimated at $22.5 million. Huge project. So with what we've raised in the past and in the present, along with some other available funds, we're at 84% of the $22.5 million. Crazy. Are you beginning to believe? So we still have lots of potential. We're continuing to apply for grants. We have 285 households who have yet to pledge. 53 of our households are giving to the campaign, but we don't have pledges from them yet, which we need for the Archdiocese. We have to have 100% pledged and 50% in the bank to build. And perhaps there are some who have already pledged, but may be held back a little because of uncertainty. Every amount helps and is needed. I'm going to increase mine by just a little bit. Friends, we've been brought into not just any family, but God's family, given not just any bread, but the bread from heaven that gives life, and invited to do this. Live your life as a gift of love. Don't put limits on what God can do. Just believe.